Neighbourhood Plan, firstly in Witley, then in Brook, and finally the good crowd of Milford. And you're very welcome to the meeting. Very grateful that you've taken the time out of the busy evening to come here. Whilst there have been 3 meetings, it is one plan for one parish. It's the same meeting, the same presentation at each meeting. But it's good to get the different views and the feedback from you as we go on. The purpose of the meeting is to discuss and learn what a neighbourhood plan is. Do we want one? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And fortunately, we have with us Chris Downing from Navigus, who's an expert in this subject, who's got the answers to all those questions and more. And he'll be taking you through a presentation, and he'll invite questions from you. We found the best way to deal with it is he does a bit of the presentation, then stops for questions on that aspect, and then at the very end we can finish it off with any questions you have on any subject relating to neighbourhood plans and planning. We're going to aim to finish about 9:30. Chris talks for about 45 minutes, and the experience of the other meetings is the rest of the time is taken up with questions and points from yourselves. On your chair, you should have some documents. We've got the feedback form, which would be grateful if you could fill in and return. There'll be people to collect them as you leave, or if you prefer to take them home and think about it and then drop them in later, feel free to do that. There's a document here which is a quick guide to neighbourhood plan, and what the politicians keep telling us is a roadmap to the neighbourhood plan process. So hopefully that will help inform you about the whole process. And just as you will see from the signs, we are recording this meeting, only this meeting, to put up on our website, so that those who haven't been able to get to any of the meetings or were so excited they want to view it again get a chance to have another look. I think probably the best thing is we just kick off with Chris and say he'll take you through some points and there's an opportunity for questions afterwards.
Right, good evening everybody. Interactive crowd, brilliant. Perhaps you said, my name's Chris Bowden, I'm from Neighbourhood Planning. We are a company that provides support to communities preparing neighbourhood plans. So that's what we are. What we are not is representatives of the Borough Council. We don't have any owners or any developers in this area at all. We are simply here appointed by the Parish Council to provide support to the community on preparing neighbourhood plan. So that is the main reason why we are here, is to talk about that. Now, the Parish Council sees that there's value in having a neighbourhood plan for the whole of Witley Parish, but it's not Parish Council's plan, and it's no plan without the support and input of the community. So if we're going to get that, we want to get you interested. So we want to inform you and enthuse you, and hopefully get as many of you to commit to getting involved. And I'll explain all the different ways that you can get involved later on in the presentation. But at the start, I want to talk about the principles of what a neighbourhood plan is and what it isn't, which is really, really important that you understand what it can and can't do. So, what a neighbourhood plan is, it's a land use plan. So it is related to all things to do with land and building. There will be an awful lot of other issues potentially that are raised throughout the process that maybe don't directly relate to land use. We can try and reflect those in the plan, but really the main part of the plan and the policies that are put into it have to relate to land use, and it's directing development over the next 15 years. That will be the intended plan period. So that's quite a long period of time, but not in planning terms. That's a fairly standard period of time. So it's a plan for new development, housing, employment, retail, all sorts of things, and the supporting infrastructure, which is very broad. When I say infrastructure, it's not just the common things you think about, roads and utilities. It also includes education, health, community facilities, green open spaces, play facilities, all sorts of things. Anything that you would expect and want to see in your community. It can influence what type of development there is, where it goes, and potentially, if you want to look at it, what it will actually look like. All these things, it's up to you. You don't have to cover anything in the plan, but these are the opportunities that are open to you. Now, this is the big point about this plan, because some of you may say, hang on a minute, haven't we done parish plans before and things like that in the past? The difference is that this plan, it will have teeth. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, a neighbourhood plan is part of what's called the development plan. So this is the thing that is used, and it's used at the moment to determine planning applications. So at the moment, the development plan consists of the policies in Waverley's current adopted local plan. Quite old, and they're in the process of trying to update that, but it's those policies in there that Waverley used to determine planning applications. Once you've produced a neighbourhood plan, that will be added to the development plan. So that will have equal weight in determining planning applications. Now, nothing will change in the way that planning applications are determined. The final decision on planning applications will still be taken by planners and by the planning committee at Waverley Borough, but they will have to make sure that they consider the policies in the neighbourhood plan as well as the policies in their own local plan, because all of those policies hold equal weight in the decision-making process. And of course, what goes into the neighbourhood plan is not in the hands of the borough, it's in your hands. And that's the crucial element of this. That plan and those policies that will hold weight can ultimately be shaped and influenced by yourselves. Now, there'll be quite a few questions, I'm sure. Some of them I'm going to try and preempt. As I said, maybe some, and certainly at our first session in Witley, there were a couple of questions that said, well, we've already had one of these in the past. We produced a parish plan a few years ago. So haven't we had something like this before? No. Whereas you had parish plans that are part of a whole element of community planning, they did not become part of a development plan. So they did not hold weight when it came to determining planning applications. They could provide a plan and a strategy and actions for community to take forward, but they were not used to determine planning applications. This is the first and only time since the start of Town and Country Planning Act in the immediate post-war period that there has been the opportunity to prepare plans at a parish level. So it really genuinely is an unparalleled opportunity. Now, some say, well, hang on a minute, this was certainly a very common theme that came out when neighbourhood planning first was brought in 2010 by the coalition government. A lot of people felt big society, localism, hang on a minute, this is just the government absolving themselves of work and the borough council's doing the same. So isn't this just the borough council saying, oh, can you do this for us because we haven't really got the resources? Well, the answer is definitely no. Because even if you don't produce a plan, Waverley has still got to produce its local plan. It has a plan for the whole borough. It's a high-level plan. It has to set that. It has a legal duty to have one of those. If there is a neighbourhood plan addressing the local detail, then that really provides a better framework. But if there isn't one, then Waverley's local plan will still apply. So they still have to produce one of those, whether you prepare a neighbourhood plan or not. But of course, providing the proper local detail, the local context that reflects what you know about your community, which is 1,000 times more than Waverley Borough knows about your community, well, that's best determined by you. Now, the plan has to be taken through the parish council. It is, within this context, the responsible body. So the Localism Act says neighbourhood plans in parish areas have to be taken through the parish council. So some people do sort of say the question, not an unreasonable question, say, well, hang on a minute, isn't this just the parish council's plan? Isn't this just something that parish councillors go away into a darkened room and come out with a plan that they want to see? Well, categorically no, that's not the case. It is facilitated by the parish council, but it has to reflect the views of the community. Not just residents, but also the views of businesses. And the reason we know that is because unlike any local plans that boroughs produce or anything like that, at the end of the preparation of a neighbourhood plan, there is a referendum. And all of those people on the electoral roll within the parish will have an opportunity to vote. And it needs the majority of those that turn out to vote yes for the plan for it to be put in place. So if 3 people turn out, as long as 2 of them say yes, the plan gets put in place. And so far, although there aren't millions of neighbourhood plans in place, none have been voted down at referendum, so no one wants to be first on that. So the plan is going to have to reflect what the majority of the community want. It can't inevitably reflect everything that everyone wants. We all know that that's just not possible. But it's got to reflect what the majority of the community wants. So if we get it wrong, then we're in trouble. So this isn't just the case of the parish council going off and doing what it wants. Now, inevitably with this process, there is a good degree, healthy degree of small print. One of the things I've heard quite commonly through the whole process since the Localism Act came in and brought in the opportunity to produce neighbourhood plans was, well, this is giving us control now, so it's got to do what we want. Well, I say, hang on a minute, it hasn't actually taken all the power from, say, the Borough Council and given it all over to you, and they now have no power and you have it all. It simply moved things more towards a better balance. So it is your plan, and it has to reflect what you want, but it doesn't automatically mean that you can get every single thing you want. Don't forget, this is a land use plan. So involved in that are going to be landowners. If you want to do things on a particular piece of land, then you have to have the landowner's consent to that. So landowners and developers are going to have to be on board. The Borough Council as well. They have a plan, but our plan has to broadly be in conformity with. We can't try and produce a neighbourhood plan here that goes against the direction that the borough is going. So they are going to have a say on things. So, and that's just a small group of possible interests. Think about all the different interested parties that will want to have a say in this. We'll have to balance things up. So it is not simply a case of people saying, well, we want this to happen, so therefore it should go in the neighbourhood plan. There are various competing interests that have to be taken into account. And plans have to be deliverable. Now what that means is, I see a plan as a sort of credible story about the future of a place and how you're going to achieve it. So it's no good saying we're going to have lots of little sites, that 3 sites say that all each deliver 5 or 10 houses, and off the back of that they're going to pay for an Olympic-sized swimming pool that we want and a new opera house or something like that. That's not going to work. We've got to balance things up. The more development you want to bring in, the more it pays for the things that you want to see. So there is a trade-off there. But ultimately, the plan has to tell a credible story about change over the next 15 years. And plans used to be written, and they used to be wonderful documents everyone thought was great, but most of it was pie in the sky. It just wasn't going to happen because it didn't take into account the sort of fundamental elements of a market, and a landowner is only going to release their land if there is going to be a certain amount of profit in it for them. That may not be terribly popular to people, but it's a fact, and it's no good us saying we want to allocate this piece of land to something. The landowner has absolutely no interest in releasing it for that because they're not going to make a reasonable profit from it. So plans have to be deliverable. An important one on the small print. Neighbourhood plans cannot be used to simply say no to development. We can't have a neighbourhood plan with any policy in it that says we do not want any development in this parish. If people want to go down that route, then they'll have to find something else other than neighbourhood planning. Because neighbourhood plans are not a way of trying to stop things happening. They have to be positive documents about change. Now, that doesn't mean that by signing up to a neighbourhood plan, it's a tacit acceptance that all of a sudden Witley is going to be absolute, as a parish, is going to be completely covered with housing. That's not what a neighbourhood plan is about. But it's equally not about trying to preserve a place in Ashton at all. Because this is a 15-year plan. You think about change over 15 years. Think about what the world was like 15 years ago. We were just about in this century. But an awful lot of things have changed. An awful lot of things have happened. So a plan has to try and look forward and try and understand what possible the opportunities are and what change will be and how to manage that. Because there is going to be change. Even if you don't produce a neighbourhood plan, there will be change here. It's a question of whether you can implement it. So, of course, that does lead us on to the type of question that is a very common one, and again, a reasonable one. Okay, so if we decide we don't want to prepare a plan, what's going to happen here? Well, the answer is, you don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. But what I do know is that all of you are going to have very, very little say in it. Because I think a lot of people's experience of the planning system is at the end that's inevitably going to be less popular. It's when planning applications come in and people say, we don't like this, right, we want to fight against that planning application. We want to stop it. And somebody actually at our first event said, well, as long as enough of us object to something, then it will get refused. No, that's not the case. When a planning application comes in, it can only be refused on planning grounds. There are only a certain amount of grounds, a basis for refusing planning applications. So trying to get involved in planning when an application comes in is real 11th hour stuff. And that's often extremely difficult to get the result that you want. And that's often why people feel a bit disillusioned and distrustful of the planning system, because they're getting involved in planning application stage. The best stage, the right stage to get involved in planning is the plan making stage. And that is this. A neighbourhood plan is the plan making stage. You get to shape the framework that will be used to determine any of those planning applications that come in the future. So you have a lot more influence over what happens. There are no guarantees. It's not about black and white. You can't say if we produce this plan, there's guarantees that you won't get this or that. But it will certainly give you a whole lot more certainty, as reasonably as you can over it. But in some respects, some things won't change. As I said, the borough will still be used to determine the planning applications here. But if you don't prepare that plan, you won't know where applications are going to come up. You won't know what type of applications are going to come up. It's going to be entirely out of your hands. So at that point, on the sort of principles and theory of neighbourhood plans, are there any questions? We'll go on to local detail and other matters later, so if you've got any questions about that, best to hold those back until the end of the next session. But are there any questions on the sort of process? Yes, there's a lady there.
Vote against the referendum.
If at the referendum the vote is no, then pass me a bin, because that's where the plan goes. You can go round again to prepare it again and have another go. There is no limit on the number of goes, but I think a lot of communities that have reached the end of their neighbourhood plan said if it was voted down and we had to go round again, I'm not sure there would be the appetite for that. So it's important that the preparation of the plan gets everyone's views as far as it can, so that it can be as reasonably certain as it can that the plan gets passed. And certainly the observation has been that most of the referenda have had yes votes in the 90%. Usually you've got turnout of around 40% with a yes vote in the 90s. So, you know, that's the kind of level that there has been of neighbourhood plans to date. There's a gentleman at the back.
I'm sorry, are you saying that we'll be voting for the structure of the neighbourhood plan, or whether we want a neighbourhood plan?
No, the referendum is at the very end of the process. You will look at the plan and say, do I want this plan put in place, or do I not want this plan put in place? So do I like what it says, or do I not like what it says?
Thank you.
Tonight, we're just trying to establish interest in the plan, and certainly the two other sessions we've had a lot of people sign up. So I think there is a general move towards wanting to produce one, but that referendum's right at the end of the process. Maybe there.
In terms of producing the plan, where does the actual strategy come from? Is it already mooted at some high level and then it's for everybody to discuss and agree, or is it actually coming from individual people in the community who say, we'd like this to happen? Or
We'll come on to how we produce the plan and where it comes from in the next session. Because there is a little, in summary, there's a little bit of the context has to be provided by the borough's local plan, but the rest of it comes from you. You can decide how many different types of issues the plan covers, what specifically it covers, entirely up to you. So you could have a neighbourhood plan that has one policy in it covering one specific matter, or you could have a neighbourhood plan that covers everything in the kitchen sink, but that's entirely up to you, the community. Yes, gentleman there in the road.
How is the question of costing dealt with?
Yeah, okay. Well, Parish Council have appointed us. They are using government grants that are available to pay for the costs of support, to pay for the costs of running events, for any material that is wanted, for sending out surveys, all the costs that there are in actually preparing a plan. There are grants out there that should pretty much cover most, if not all, of that cost. And some of the later costs of things like a referendum are borne by the borough council. So when that's run by their electoral services, that cost is borne by the borough.
How do you get the lease into the plan? How do you get the actual building proposals? I mean, how do you get why don't you put 20 houses on that field there? Who puts that in?
Well, we'll come on a bit to that, but I think it kind of... Some plans choose to specifically identify sites on which they will say we want this to happen, or we would expect this to happen, this to happen, and this to happen. Other plans just provide a bit more of a framework. Most plans look at sites, and the way to look at sites is you have to go out and ask people if they've got land that they would be interested in putting forward. It doesn't prejudge whether the community likes that, but you need a long list of land in order to establish which ultimately becomes the short list.
And who does
comes into the plan? Well, those that are running and involved in the plan. I mean, if we're here helping you, then we can help you with that process. So, yeah, you've got to ask, is the way. Right, hang on a minute, we've got a lot of hands. So I'll do one there, and then there were two more people there.
Given that the way the local plan is still some way down the track, how many fixed points is a local neighbourhood plan going to have?
It's a good question about the Waverley local plan. An up-to-date one is still a way off. We can come on to the real meaty issue of housing numbers. I mean, we will have in the short term some uncertainties about that. We know that the Waverley local plan is going to require Milford to accommodate some housing. We don't know what those numbers are, but I think as we move through the process, the Waverley local plan should start to provide a degree of clarity about where it's going. But yeah, I mean, in that respect, there are certain things that are critical from the local plan, and if we run ahead too far of it, we do run the risk of, if for some reason their strategy is saying something different to ours, that we could be in conflict. So that is something to be mindful of. Right, there was a lady there.
Yes, you said earlier that this plan has teeth. If there is a conflict between what the community wants and what the borough needs or has to have or perceives that we shouldn't, where do we go? I mean, who comes out on top? How is that resolved?
Yeah.
I see we're, sort of get the feeling that we as the local community, the parish council, would be at the bottom of the stack and would be overridden.
Well, the local plan that's produced by Waverley, it sets the high-level strategic framework. So, for example, it will set the overall housing numbers, which is part of the reason why it's had to take so long, because of trying to establish what those housing numbers are, and then the broad strategy for where that goes. So it is, we'll come on to this again in a minute, it sort of says where the larger villages and how many houses they will accommodate. Now, you can't go against that high-level strategic number of the number of houses. You can provide more than it, but you can't actively provide less. Well, you can provide less, but then Waverley will come along and find more sites to top it up. But outside of things like that, and for example, the proportion of housing that is delivered as affordable housing, most of the rest of things are actually down to local detail. So there's actually relatively little in the context, certainly for somewhere like this, that is actually going to be set at that Waverley level and that we can't be in conflict with. Pretty much most of the rest of the things are up to you. But if there is a conflict, then that would be a problem. So that's something we do need to steer clear of. Right, there's a gentleman there, and then two more, and then we'll move on. And if people haven't had a chance to ask their questions, you can ask them. We'll make sure everyone has their chance later.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of greenbelt land in here. Is there any plans to build on any of that?
Yeah. Greenbelt is...
Sorry, Chris, can you just repeat the question?
Sorry, yes, as a gentleman said about greenbelt. there's a lot of greenbelt land. Any decisions about changing the greenbelt is one of the other issues that does rest with Waverley. Now, a neighbourhood plan can suggest that pieces of land are taken out of the greenbelt so that they can be allocated for housing if supported by the community, and that would then be done at a later date by Waverley. So the neighbourhood plan cannot allocate sites in the greenbelt itself. It can recommend sites through its plan that can then be subsequently taken out of the greenbelt. But certainly the high-level issues about greenbelt, obviously a very contentious issue here, do sit with Waverley, and their emerging plan, and certainly when they come to a view on, well, whenever it is later in the year, they come out with their their first pass at their new strategy, we should have an idea of where they're looking to release greenbelt or where they're looking to add greenbelt as well. Because I know they are looking at that as well. Okay, there were a couple of other hands. There was a gentleman there. Yes, sorry. Yeah, perhaps. Yes.
If there's impasse, would we need to have a public inquiry?
When you say impasse, the question was if there's impasse, would we need a public inquiry? What? Sorry, when you say impasse, what in terms of what happens between ourselves and Waverley?
If after the referendum was equal status, would we need to go to the referendum for public inquiry?
So in other words, if at the referendum it was split, well, I think we'd be down to counting the individual votes. So you'd have to have exactly the same number of votes for as against. I'm not sure the regulations say. I think probably you would have to go round again because you wouldn't have that majority. But the prospect of however many hundreds and thousands of people turning out that there was an exact split of yes and no, I think, well, it's unlikely. But in that situation, it would have to go. You effectively haven't got the mandate you need to go forward. So, sorry, one more question, then we will come to some more. There's a gentleman behind the gentleman that just asked the question.
On your roadmap.
It's not mine. Go for the roadmap.
Which
Yeah.
stage are we at the moment?
Well, we are.
Is this community engagement and involvement?
This is the very start of community engagement. I will talk more about community engagement as later on, but this is the very start of that process. The Parish Council has applied for neighbourhood area designation, and that has now been received. So we now have established that the parish is the neighbourhood area. So now this is very much starting that process of getting people interested, starting the engagement. So we're not at the very, very start, but we're at the next stage.
Does that mean there's a project plan somewhere that's available?
That's the next stage that needs to be put together. I mean, we have a skeleton one that's sort of based on the roadmap, but putting a project plan together will very much depend on, for example, the number of groups, the range of themes that people want to cover, and we'll come on to that again in a minute. So we're not at a stage where we can put down the detailed project plan because we don't know the extent of the plan that the community would like to put together. Right, I'm just going to move on to the next stage, but we can take more questions at the next break. Just want to try and keep things moving. So if you didn't get a chance to ask a question but want to, don't worry, you will get the chance. Because the lady at the back asked the question, well, look, how do we actually produce this plan? You know, what do we start with? And to a certain extent, you could say you start with a sort of blank sheet of paper, but in reality, you don't. You know that we are producing here a plan, well, it's for 15 years, some produce this for 20 years, but we're producing ostensibly a 15-year plan. So I think a good way to start is to project forward and to say, okay, what do we want this parish to look like at the end of the plan period in 15 years' time? What do we want to have achieved? How do we want to have effected change? And start to sort of go to the end and work the way back is the best way. And up there on the board, there is that word that a lot of people don't like, sustainable, sustainability, sustainable development. Planning is all about it, but funnily enough, even the government today announced that the select committee came out and said that certain improvements should have been made to the National Planning Policy Framework, which is the national planning document, and one of them should be a more specific definition of sustainable development, but the government said no, they didn't want to do that, and I think probably because someone was petrified they'd have to put the words down. It's extremely difficult to define sustainability, but what I say to you is it can pretty much mean, to a degree, what you would like it to mean. What we know is that there are three facets to sustainability. There's environmental sustainability, which I think most people can recognise. There is social sustainability, very important for communities, and there is economic sustainability. They are the three factors, and everyone will weigh them up differently in different circumstances. So there is no hard and fast rule. There is not a case that there always has to be a balance in the way you weigh them up. So a lot of it really comes down to what you want to achieve, but we do have to try and take these principles of sustainability on board. But the key starting point is, what do we want this place to be in 15 years' time? What do we want to see happen? And in trying to answer that question, there's in theory a simple 4-step process. Firstly, well, it's establishing, okay, within that context of saying, well, what do we want this place to look like? It's, well, what are the issues we've got here today? What do we like about this place? What do we not like about this place? What do we want to see? What do we want to deal with? And then trying to establish a bit of the evidence behind that. Often there's an issue and people say, well, this is the facts about it. And of course, then someone challenges them. And if you haven't got evidence, then you haven't really got a case. The whole plan has to be built on evidence. We have to be able to say, look, this is how we arrived at this view, because the evidence tells us. That evidence comes from things like the census, all that information. Waverley Borough has got a raft of technical reports and every kind of thing you could probably think of, but also the evidence from all of you and everyone else out there. That's equally as important. The evidence from the community, what you see, what you observe, how you move, how you travel, what would make you change, whatever it is, that is all evidence, and it needs to be gathered to better understand the nature of the issue that you think you want to try and cover. So once you've got your issues and your evidence, you then say, okay, how can we best deal with this problem? And the temptation is to say, well, the obvious thing to do is this. But actually, you do need to, again, through this process, you do need to demonstrate that you have at least considered all the reasonable alternative options. Not every single theoretical possible way of dealing with a problem. That's unreasonable. But all the reasonable options. Because if you can you demonstrate that you considered all of those, then eventually you can clearly say, look, the best way to deal with this issue, based on the evidence and considering all the ways we could of doing this, is this way, our preferred option. This is how we deal with the issue. So it's that 4-step process. Issues, evidence, options, preferred option. And that preferred option is the thing that goes into the plan. It's the policy. It says what you want to do. So that's how you start to move from an issue, whatever it may be, and we'll come on to talk about issues in a minute, right the way through to writing the plan. That's not something that's done quickly. It does take time, and particularly a lot of groups feel that the evidence gathering stage says, oh, it's taking forever. But that's a good thing, because it is a lot to gather all that evidence, and if you gather it well and are thorough about it, then you are armed with everything that you need. So, part of that process of gathering evidence from the community is through engagement. It's not consultation, because most people's experience of consultation, particularly in planning, is someone asks your view, you give it, and then they ignore it and go off and do what they wanted to do anyway, and say, we've consulted everyone. This is engagement. It's an ongoing process with the community, talking about particular issues. If it's going to reflect what people want, then you have to be asking people. And often it's not just their first answer to a question, it's the follow-up answers that you tease out of them. It's starting a dialogue and getting to really understand what people think about things. And you can do that any way you want. There are no hard and fast rules about how you do this. It's not just a case of meetings in a hall with a lecture theatre style thing where you listen to some bloke like me talk a lot. Far better to actually have different ways of engaging with the community. You know people here best, you know how best to potentially engage with them. So do it through all the different ways you want, whether it's workshops, whether it's meetings, Surveys. Surveys are fine, but you can only ask one question at a time. So you want to make sure you think carefully about the right time to ask questions in a survey, because you know what people are like. Most of us won't want to answer a survey if it's any more than 10 short tick box questions. So you've got to be very clear about what you want to get out of it. Now, the intention is that through the plan, we'll need to obviously publicise this thing, make everyone aware of where it's at, what it's saying, what we're asking, where the next big event is. So there will need to be a whole range of ways of advertising this, getting it out there. Parish Council newsletter. We've already made the Surrey Advertiser a couple of days ago, apparently. So, using the newspaper. There's a Neighbourhood Plan website, so things like this presentation will go on there. It should be an information resource for people. Social media can be hit, can be miss, need to be used carefully. Certainly don't just think if we use Facebook we'll be able to talk to young people. Young people don't use Facebook, it's something their parents use. So think carefully about how you want to use all the different things that are out there. So then we come on to, okay, what possible issues could we cover in this? And this is where we get to the sort of Trivial Pursuit style list. This is not a finite list. This is not a list of things that you are required to cover. This is just a common list of the types of issues that a lot of other neighbourhood plans are covering. Housing, of course. Transport, always a tricky issue to cover, particularly when it comes to traffic and things, but plans are trying to do it. Employment, commerce, retail. A lot of things that I put under that infrastructure theme, education and health. Then there's the environment and all the different aspects of that. And then recreation, again, infrastructure. And arts and culture. So you may all say, right, we just want a really focused plan that focuses on this, whatever it may be. You can do that if you want. And I think a lot of plans maybe start and maybe overstretch themselves. And of course, the more you want to cover, the more complex, because all of these areas will interlink with one another. They will all cut across each other. So of course, the more different issues you're dealing with, the more areas will cut across each other, and the more tricky it is. It's fine, but you just got to know it will take longer and will need more work. So it's entirely up to you. Now, here's an example of how some other groups are dealing with a certain issue, housing. Let's pick the big one here, because also it helps to provide a little bit of that important emerging context of what the Waverley plan is giving us as a framework. So, the emerging local plan classes Witley and Milford as larger villages, and it's certainly the expectation is that all of the larger villages across the borough are going to have to provide a degree of housing. The largest settlements, Godalming, Farnham, Haslemere and Cranley will take the bulk of development. Then there's the larger villages under them that will take a significant number, albeit not as much. So there are 5 larger villages based on the options that were consulted on late last year. It's looking like there would be somewhere between 300 and 450 houses across those 5 villages, not each, across those 5 villages. But it's unlikely they're going to break it down any more than that. So there wouldn't necessarily be a number for Witley and a number for Milford. So that's potentially where we will be, and we will have more certainty about that. One thing I forgot to say, Brook as a smaller village, there's no expectation it would have to accommodate housing. It doesn't mean it can't if it wants to, but there is no expectation that it would expect to find sites, because it is a smaller village, far less services, a less sustainable place to put housing. Now, of course, we will know more about the numbers. I'll say later in 2015. The borough certainly hasn't said when it is going to be. They are waiting for more information, so we don't know, but that'll be something we will need to keep our eye on. So that's the context we have that we're working with for housing. So what can we cover if we are going to deal with housing? Well, here's a range of common types of issues that neighbourhood plans are dealing with on housing. So often groups say, look, let's put aside the numbers of houses. What has happened here in the past is all the housing that's been built has been large family housing, which is great for people who want large family housing, but but actually it completely excludes the two groups that already live here at the moment that would actually like to stay living here but can't because it's not providing the right types of housing. And those are first-time buyers and also older people looking to downsize out of large family housing. Those two groups want different things. So, you know, first-time buyers want anything they can lay their hands on, small properties. Older downsizers have got more equity, so tend to want something a little bit larger but manageable. So potentially a 3-bed house, apartments, that type of thing. Very, very common. Maybe it's not the case here, but it's an example because the neighbourhood plan, with the right evidence, could have a policy that insists that all housing developments actually provide more of a mix with a greater proportion of smaller housing in terms of the number of bedrooms. So you start to then address an issue that there is locally by making sure that what's built in the future doesn't replicate or exacerbate the problem that you've got now. So that's the type. Now, of course, often the big one that groups want to get their teeth into is the where, and that's when you get a lot of people involved. You know, as soon as you've got sites and lines on map, where should development be built? Are there suitable sites? Now, I always see that as an opportunity when you're looking at sites, is not just for housing, but for those sites to provide alongside the housing, maybe other community facilities that you want. So on there, you know, what we're saying at the bottom, well, what community facilities can we get? If we allocate this site for some housing, we want a new village hall. We would actually expect a village hall to be located there. It's an excellent location, well located that everybody can get to, so we will allocate the site and Mr. or Mrs. developer, in order that you are able to develop and get your housing, you will have to also provide the land or even build a village hall for us there. So all of a sudden, you are actually creating the means by which you can achieve something that the community wants to deliver. Some groups want to consider design. Now, design is always a really tricky type of issue because it's very subjective. Yes, in your chocolate box villages that are all made of all the houses look the same and are made of the local stone and everything, maybe that's easier, but it's often more tricky in areas where there is a greater range of housing. I'm not trying to put you off, I'm just saying, but it is an issue that you could have. You could have policies that insist on particular design principles for housing, the way it looks. Although my experience is that people actually, when you talk to them about this, it's less about the design of the houses, it's more about the layout of them, so that they actually become more friendly, functional public spaces. And that's another thing that you could look at. So that's just one example of one theme and topic that you may or may not want to cover, entirely optional. But at that point, I'll say, over to you. You tell us what the issues are of importance, and maybe we can discuss whether that's something that you can cover. So, you know, what are the issues that you think, well, if we're going to do a neighbourhood plan, I think this is something that we should look at. Over here.
Slightly off from that question, this whole question of risk is coming up in my mind. We develop a plan based on nice ideas of what we want, what the issues are for us. And I worked in government and I'm long enough to know how this works. You say it was a presentation, but actually we develop a plan and then Waverley come up with something that's in conflict with that. What's the link between the plan we agree and individual proposals that come along that we haven't foreseen? Because they could easily say, oh well, you know, you had your plan, yes, we've got a proposal to build on that particular piece of land, you didn't consider it in your plan, therefore your plan doesn't really count in this instance. So it comes back to the questions about the conflict between the two.
So if people didn't hear that question, it was basically if an application comes in after we've produced our plan on a piece of land that we didn't consider in the neighbourhood plan, Waverley, as the planning authority said, well, you didn't consider it, we think it's fine, so we're going to grant it permission. Well, I think the plan, if we put together a comprehensive plan, should try and cover us, because the principle will be, we know that we have to take a proportion of housing, so we will allocate the sites where it will go. In our existing built-up settlements, there will continue to be the windfalls, the little 1s and 2s here and there. We don't know where they are because they are windfalls. and we will say that outside of those settlement areas and outside of our site allocations is open countryside, and therefore it has protection against it. So we've actually got the framework to say the development will go here, here and here, and dotted around within the existing urban area. Everything else is open countryside, so the general principle should be no. Now, as I said before, it is no categorical guarantee that every single planning application outside the settlement areas will automatically be refused planning permission. But with that framework in place, you could certainly have a lot more certainty that those applications would be refused. So you can never say never with planning. It's not a black and white type of case. But if you don't have that plan, then put it this way: Waverley will be the ones who will be determining where your settlement boundary is, and they'll be the ones who might be saying, well, we actually think that all of these sites around here should go into the plan, rather than the ones that you're saying. So it's important that the plan has the right full framework to make sure that it allocates the sites you want, but protects you against development on the areas that you don't want. Gentleman there.
Thank you. It seems to me that living in this area for a number of years would be that the real problem that we're facing, a major problem in my view, is all to do with traffic movements. We've got 3 major trunk roads, and frankly, it's just ruining this particular area, Milford in particular, I think. So, to me, that would be actually a key point, how we try and handle the issue.
Right, so the gentleman said that the key issue is traffic. Now, traffic is always going to be just about the most difficult issue, because you've got what you say now at the moment is an existing traffic problem. What you know is there is going to be more development here, Godalming, everywhere else around you, which therefore will bring more traffic out. Now, a plan that tries to say we're going to reduce the levels of traffic congestion it's almost impossible to achieve. But maybe there are other ways of looking at the problem and saying, okay, how can we provide for alternative forms that people will use? Improving bus services, improving access by bike and on foot. It might not, to some people, make much difference, but the plan has to recognise its limitations and the fundamental limitations of the fact that most people want to own a car, and many households own a lot more than one car each. So, I think it's trying to work with what you've got, recognise the limitations, and maybe say, well, what is the issue? Is the issue simply the amount of time it takes at junctions, or is it actually, with the amount of cars, a safety issue? Because if it's a safety issue, that's something that we can deal with. If there are particular junctions or areas whereby there are problems, that's maybe something that with the plan can look at and try and deal with. But one that's trying to deal with getting less cars queuing in front of you at a junction is always going to be a very difficult issue to deal with in a neighbourhood plan, or indeed any plan. I think you speak to the county council and they'd acknowledge it's extremely difficult to deal with. So I'm not sure that was the answer you wanted to hear, but it's just one of those problems. Well, this is what Godalming is doing with their plan. They've said there is no point us trying to pretend that we can provide new roads, make everything better, certainly not in anywhere such as a town such as Godalming. So they're really focusing very strongly on what it will take to get people out of their cars and onto other forms of transport. Now, I know Godalming is a very different place. It is a larger town. It has all those services, so it's a different set of issues and opportunities they have. But the plan has explicitly tried to say that, so that it's focusing on something it feels it can achieve, rather than hoping it can deal with something it probably can't. Gentleman there.
If you're commissioned to produce a plan, how will you decide which person's view takes precedence over another person's view? And do you have a set form of criteria for validating that?
So the question was, if I write the plan, do I have and there are competing views, do I have a set of criteria for determining them? I'm not writing the plan. Well, I am potentially could be writing the plan, as in putting the words on the paper in planning speak, but the plan is ultimately written by you, the community. It is simply, I'll be there effectively acting as sort of editor of what you want to achieve. It's not me writing the plan in terms of the meat of it. But if the issue is to do with competing issues and interests, then that is something that if you get to a point where there are clearly split views about something and lots of differences of opinion, then you need to look at ways of having more engagement that starts to get to the bottom of those issues. Because often where seemingly people have differing views, they actually they both want the same thing, they just differ in their opinion about how you go about it. So sometimes there is no substitute for getting people with differing opinions in a room and actually having a discussion around that. So it's got to recognise that where there are tricky issues, you've got to try and resolve those so that you can go into a referendum with a degree of certainty. And ultimately, if there is an issue that completely splits the community and there is no prospect of dealing with it, then it may be something that the plan wants to consider whether it actually doesn't deal with it. You know, that's a sort of worst case scenario, but there's a referendum at the end of this, so it is the ultimate. See, the borough has the luxury of not having to have a referendum at the end of its production of its local plan. Here we do. So, hang on a minute, sorry, I will go to you because there's a gentleman there and then you next.
Given the complexity and possible conflict of an issue, at what point at all would an expert advise? And how does that happen?
Yeah, so the gentleman asked when there is a conflict or an issue, when will expert advice be taken on board? I think the expert advice should come on board as early as possible to inform you before you get to the conflict. If you're dealing with an issue, gathering that evidence, it'll be really important to gather that from the experts. So if you want to look at flooding, we want to talk to the Environment Agency. If we want to talk about traffic or transport, we want to talk to the county. Education, which I know is a big issue here. Again, the county, to understand the nature of what their opinions are on those issues as they affect Witley Parish and Milford and places. So it's really important to get the view from the experts early on to inform that discussion.
So saying the experts of the system, not your own choice of experts.
Sorry?
You're saying that the experts are the system, the environment, not your choice.
Well, they are, I'd put it this way, the county are the highway authority, they are the education authority, they are the providers of roads and schools. So if we're going to be planning for provision of roads and schools, then we need to make sure that we've got the county on board with it. Again, it's that same principle as if a landowner that we want to allocate their land doesn't like it, there's no point us equally saying we want to do something with education if the county puts in a formal objection to it. That's no different to Waverley and their plan as well. So we need to get them on board, but obviously at the start, when we're trying to establish the nature of issues, it'll be important to engage with them at an early stage. And we can help you with that process, because some of them, you know, it may be quite tricky to get in and get involved in that. So gentleman at the back, and then I'll come to the lady here.
What is wrong with the current system that we actually have in practice at the minute, and why do we need to spend the money going on the neighbourhood plan when we voted the local council into power?
Well, I don't know. It'd be interesting to get a view of the community here about whether they think Waverley and its system is working. No one when this came in 2010 with the coalition government necessarily thought anything was wrong, but what the coalition did think was that a lot of local people felt disenfranchised in the planning of the future of their areas for exactly the reasons I described earlier, when a planning application would come in and they would feel powerless to influence it. So the whole process of taking planning down to the local level where local people can have a say was therefore given as an opportunity, which is why it's an optional. You don't have to do it if you don't want. So of course, if you all turn around and say we're perfectly happy with the system, there's no point preparing one, then I think the parish council would say, well, okay, there's no point us preparing one and we won't do. So it's entirely up to you and how you view Waverley's role.
Yeah, I get that. There's a danger having three tiers with the national framework, the local framework, and then the neighbourhood framework. You dilute the issues so much. that you can't actually come up with a constructive plan.
Hopefully some of the examples I've given have suggested areas where I wouldn't believe there would be dilution. For example, you deciding where housing should go and what should be delivered alongside it, I don't think is a dilution. Waverley could make that decision, but they would make that decision in consultation with you, and you may give your views on it, but there's not much certainty that your views will hold sway. Whereas in a neighbourhood plan preparation process, exactly the same thing that you're doing at the end of the day, but it is one that is held amongst the local community. You know all the land, the sites better, you know what would work better, what wouldn't work better, you know where the local flooding issues are despite what the Environment Agency might say, all of those types of issues. You know that better than Waverley do, so the argument should be that you would have you would come up with a better split of sites and land to be able to do that. But I don't want to be too housing focused on that. It's an example. I agree that if a plan tries to produce a lot of the same policies that are already there that Waverley have produced, that's pointless. And ditto with the National Planning Policy Framework. This isn't about repeating policies because it'll make them stronger. It won't. They'll probably just end up getting struck out of the plan. It's providing that local detail where it is important to do so. Right, lady here.
Yeah, so following on from that, there's a certain amount of stuff that's being loaded on us from up above that we are not even allowed to question. Like, we have to have 350 new houses, whatever. I know that's been raised at other meetings, the question of why and who are they for. But one of the things that's really struck me recently is that Waverley have granted permission for swathes of new houses to be built, like up at Milford Hospital, under the label of affordable. And it goes back to the same thing you were saying about sustainable development. There's no one definition. Affordable housing apparently is houses of £400,000.
Yeah, it's all relative.
It's very relative. And actually, if we in our local plan say, you know what, we want affordable housing, so we want young people who are leaving homes, starting up, want to raise a family, something small, start at home. If we call that affordable housing, but Waverley say, no, £630,000 houses, 5 bedrooms in the garden is what we call affordable. Where actually do we have any real sway in this? Because so much of it comes down to what's being imposed on us, what other people define. What Waverley is called a floodplain is an interesting one. You just raised that. Local people would call it something rather different. So actually, what are our teeth in all this?
Well, the teeth, I mean, the lady raised issues about affordable housing and what constitutes affordable here. And I mean, I think, costs of £400,000 is, it's out of any first-time buyer's range, but also often it's to do with the supply of housing, that actually there is a lack of the smallest type of housing that would be at a lower price. Also, there's the opportunity potentially to look at holding affordable housing in perpetuity for local people, looking at various mechanisms around that can give you greater certainty that the housing will be held here for local people, and potentially you could look at things like community land trusts that will also ensure that housing can then be offered to local people at a sensible rate. There are other mechanisms there, some of which don't need a neighbourhood plan, but an awful lot of them, the plan opens up the opportunity to do it. But, you're raising problems of housing affordability that absolutely are always going to be an issue here, and hence the government announced in the last couple of days that if there are brownfield sites, they'll let developers develop them for 20% subsidy, or reduction of 20% of the cost. But of course, in lieu of them providing any affordable housing in the true planning sense. So what it gives with one hand, it seems to take away with the other. But a neighbourhood plan gives you an opportunity to see if there's something you can do about it. I'm not saying the issue is going to be easy to tackle, but it is something that gives you the opportunity and the chance to deal with it. Because you're right, chances are, if you don't do anything, then that system's just going to situation's just going to get worse. So it's trying to see what we can do.
Is there anything you can do about the fact that the small houses in my area come up for sale and immediately they are bought by people with money for houses to let. Is there anything we can do about that?
So the lady asked about smaller houses being bought to let. So in other words, they're taken off the market for people to buy. That's not something specifically that the planning system can prevent, because it's somebody's right to buy a house and then if they choose to let it out, to do so. But what we can try and do is provide housing, more housing of the type that you need, and maybe through a different vehicle of providing it so that it can be held for local people to buy and to be retained in that way. So we could look.
Can you control that?
Well, there are possibly mechanisms out there to be able to control it. It comes back to this point about housing held in perpetuity for local people, and maybe there are mechanisms out there. Some people, for example, almshouses, some use as an innovative use where if it's actually delivered as almshouses, they can therefore be held in perpetuity and given to people, and there are mechanisms which people can buy them after a certain period of time. If not, then they move on and it's
some of
for
these
somebody
houses
else.
these people have 4 or 5 houses which they rent out, which would be just perfect for first-time buyers.
Well, like I said, we can't stop people from purchasing housing and then subsequently renting it out, but we can try and look if there are other ways of dealing with the problem. That's the market.
You build all this social housing. Is there anything to prevent somebody coming along and buying 4 or 5 of these and letting them out?
Well, some vehicles for providing social housing ensure that they are retained as social housing in perpetuity. So there are ways of doing it. So if this is a big issue to cover, it's a complex and tricky area, but it's often one that comes up. So it's something that we could look at. So again, I sound like a stuck record saying it's going to be difficult, there's no guarantees, but the plan could try to look at it. Because yours isn't the only area where, yes, all the social housing is built, great, local people, and then it's all of a sudden it's taken away and it's gone and you're back where you started. So something that could be dealt with. Okay, shall I go on? There's a gentleman there. We'll take that as a question and then we'll go on to the next section, which is sort of the last one.
Sorry, I'm on this at the beginning, but who employs Neighbourhood Planning?
The Parish Council have appointed us and are using government grants.
We get grants from central government to pay for it.
Yes, we're appointed by the Parish Council. The Parish Council has applied for a grant from central government, and they're using part of that grant to cover the costs of our support. And the rest of the grant will be used for the community to hold events related to the neighbourhood plan and all the materials you may or may not need.
So, what employees do a presentation?
Well, they're employing us to help you with the plan. So if you do want to decide to go through the plan, we will provide the support that you need. So we're working with neighbourhood plans, and there are various working groups, and they'll say, we've got this problem, how do we deal with it? Or can you attend one of our meetings because we've got to discuss a tricky issue on social housing and we want to maybe look at it. And then maybe later on, a lot of the neighbourhood plans, we're helping you to actually write the document, because a lot of work goes into it, and then groups go, now we've actually got to write this thing, help, what do we do? So we can help you.
Can send you an email if you want.
Oh yeah, all of that type of thing. The nature of the support will be face-to-face, it will be email, it will be telephone. We're there to support you and help you preparing the plan rather than sort of floundering around and teach yourself planning lesson 1 type thing. Right, we'll take one more and then we'll move on.
Can I ask Mr. Stewart whether we in the parish have enough brownfield sites for 400 or 500 houses that are needed?
It's 400 or 500 across 5 villages. It's not 400 or 500 for Milford and 400 or 500 for Witley. If you're doing a pro rata, you might say it could be 100. It might be less.
I don't know. It is one of the first to investigate what sites are there.
You probably, between you, may know a number of brownfield sites. As the question was, are there enough brownfield sites? You may well know and have an idea of sites. See, again, local people know the potential of sites more than anybody else. So,
I'm not sure what the definition of brownfield site is.
Previously developed.
but no, it's not green.
Yeah, so if it's green,
So-
literally,
so
the colour green.
Milford Hospital is regarded as
That's brown.
Milford Hospital was a brownfield site, a previously developed site. It's an interchangeable term, brownfield, previously developed.
5% of the area was developed.
Yeah, well, yeah. There's an interest. There's all sorts of case law and things about that. So about the definition, the lawyer's charter. Can we move on and then we'll take questions again?
Does Witley Camp come under brownfield?
Oh, sorry. Does Witley
Witley Camp.
Camp?
Brownfield.
Would Witley Camp be around
Again,
here?
if we go to the Neighbourhood Planning, that's what we're going to have to investigate, is what ground such as that,
Yeah.
or what we feed for development, it's an investigation.
Right. Okay, so how can I get involved then? Because we've all enthused you, you can't wait to sign up. We've locked the doors so you can't leave until you've signed up anyway. Well, first thing you want to do is tell us. And tell us also, we're asking you to sign up tonight if you want to, no obligation, and if you want to go away and have a think about it, that's fine too. Don't worry, it's not a one-shot deal here. And also tell us what kind of issues are important to you, because what we want to do is once we've got all the interested people, we want to try and put you into the groups of things that you're interested in rather than allocating you to be in a group that you have no interest in whatsoever. So we need to know what kind of things you're interested in. If you're interested in everything, that's fine, tell us. But we do want to know, because it'll help us as we put our working groups together. So, as I said, there'll be a number of working groups. You can be on as many working groups as you like. It just means you'd be busier. So, try and sign up tonight before you leave. You can still sign up after tonight. Get in touch with Fiona the clerk. Here are her details. This we will put on the website. So hopefully it should be straightforward. But a few questions then. You'll say, okay, is this going to take up a lot of my time? If I sign up, what am I signing my life away? And the answer really should be no. It's very difficult to know how long a plan is going to take to produce, but what we do know is it won't be quick. If you think it's still going to be done by the middle of the summer, unfortunately, it's going to take longer than that. Often the actual preparation of a plan can take at least a year. And that's just getting you to the start of the statutory consultation process. So the actual point from now to having your first full complete draft can often take a year because of the nature of the issues you're dealing with. So if a working group will probably meet maybe up to half a dozen times over a, say, 8 to 10 month period. So that gives you an idea. It's not as if you've got to block out every single Monday in your diary from now until about 2018. It's not the case. Groups will meet, they will decide when they meet, you'll discuss things, you then will each go away and maybe say, well, I'll go and do a little bit of work on that, I'll do that. So there will be a little bit of evidence gathering, things to do in between meetings. But that's really the extent of it. Each group will have to have a lead person. That's entirely up to you. So at your first meeting, you can all look at each other and say, who wants to lead this? And everyone can pretend to have dropped their pencil. But, it's entirely up to you. There are no hard and fast rules about how you do this. These are suggestions about the way you do it. But each group does, as I'm sure you can appreciate, need a lead person, at least to lead the meetings. Now, you could say, God, I don't know anything about planning. You're very lucky, I say. You don't have to. I think as I've described, we're here to help you through the process. So we want you to focus on the issues. We can guide you with any questions you may have. You don't, if you don't want to. If you do want to write the document at the end, brilliant. You can do that. But often groups will say, we know what we want to achieve with this, we just don't know what words to use. So that's something that we can help you with. So here's a suggestion of what we're proposing at the moment of how the working groups will work. So each working group will have to have a minimum number of people. If you have less than 4 people, which is what we're suggesting, then it tends to be very, very small, a lot of work, and sometimes there could be that possible suggestion that a group is actually just a couple of people who just want to do their own thing. But an important point, working groups do not make the decisions. They're simply the sort of vehicle through which the plan is taken forward and on to the next stages. So it is not a case that if you're not on a working group, you won't get to see what you want in the plan. The working groups simply provide the framework for getting getting things moving. But having a minimum of 4 is what we suggest. Working party group members should ideally be either residents, have a business, own land or property, premises within the parish. It doesn't have to be that way, but certainly we have had a couple of people from outside the parish who've come along to these events, and if they want to get involved, they should be given the opportunity. They should declare the fact that they're from outside, and it should therefore be for the group to decide, and the steering group to decide whether it is reasonable for them to be involved. And I have been involved in another neighbourhood plan where a gentleman came from actually outside, but he came to the town to do all of his shopping. He worked there and everything for a very long time. So he wanted to get involved. Everyone said yes, and before he knew it, he was chairman of the whole thing. So it's not trying to exclude people, but it's right to have a broad framework. Lastly, each working party should make notes, and I say notes, we don't want detailed minutes of everything, pages and pages, but these will be a public record so that everyone from outside can see what's going on in a working group. So just a few notes, it doesn't have to be pages and pages, of roughly what was discussed and certainly what was agreed to be done coming out of the meeting. So pretty light touch, entirely up to you how you deal with it, but that is a request to the working parties that they do take notes. So, that point, any other questions? Yes, maybe.
Obviously, like Milford will develop their thinking of theirs.
No, lady asked whether.
If we meet up, if we say that, we're working through, will we then meet up in different villages, or how's that kind of going?
Well, I think lady asked about whether there is, where you're going to meet if you're covering a single issue or a working group. There will not be a working group on housing for Milford or working group on housing for Witley, well, not necessarily. So where will you meet up? I think it really will be a case of there will be a single working group covering a theme. So yes, you have to agree where you're going to meet up. So you may want to meet up in different places and sort of rotate around the different villages, because we do want to try and get a spread under each working group of where people come from. Now, it may be that certainly things like housing that are looking at things like sites, we may have little subgroups that specifically deal with the individual areas, but certainly some of the broader topics, I think there will be one single group. So
the villages are so different in terms of like the retail here.
Yep.
There's far more shops and everything in Milford than there are in the other villages. So the issues for the different villages are all, apart from the housing, which, as you say, is common to all, different.
Well, the issues are different, so I think a working group, it's important that it does consider the nature of the issues for each of the villages. It is important that there is a coherence between what the plan is saying for each of them, but equally the plan can say, in Milford, retail, we've got a main retail centre, we want to protect this. In the other villages, there isn't, so therefore it's individual local shops, and we'll have a policy for that. So we could end up with policies for each of the individual different villages, but it will all come under the banner of one plan. So it's important that a working group does recognise that. But for example, taking retail, chances are there would be more people from Milford interested in retail maybe than there would be from Brook. Maybe not, I don't know, but it's got to recognise the needs of each of the areas.
You made a point early on about the surprise of planning. When planning consent is asked for, and you're saying what's important is that communities have a lead time, so they're not surprised by things occurring in planning. So my question is, if you're on one of these working groups, do you get access to information that Waverley hold? For example, I've heard lots of rumours about green fields that are on the radar to be built over or whatever, yeah? And I suspect a lot of people in this room are here because they are concerned about that threat. But I have no idea whether it's true that these things are on Waverley's radar or not, or how far up the pecking order these things are. So if I was going to work on a neighbourhood plan in the interest of our community, I'd want to know what Waverley've got in their plan already. What is threat, what is the opportunity that we're working to?
Yeah. Well, all of the information from Waverley that is in the public domain will be accessible to us. In terms of sites and land that Waverley are considering developing, they're still at the stage of preparing their high-level plan. Outside of the very biggest, the largest strategic sites of several hundred or so houses or more, their local plan will not be talking about that. So I can't see a situation where they are earmarking large swathes of greenfield sites around the villages here to be putting into their plan. That may be the case in some of the largest settlements within the borough, but not in its larger villages. It is aware, and the officers are aware, that the intention is to produce a neighbourhood plan here. So therefore, it very much is the case that the neighbourhood plan will be the vehicle through which sites are allocated. That won't be the job of the borough. If there is one of the larger villages where a neighbourhood plan isn't produced, then the borough will have to do that job. But if the neighbourhood plan is doing that job, then it will be done by the neighbourhood plan in the community. It will provide information on sites that are available, excuse me, sites that are available, that have been brought forward as suggested by landowners or developers, but it will not be looking to put any of those sites in its plan. And of course, the rumours come out, and I think often they come out from things that relate to when Waverley, as the local planning authority, has to do what's called a call for sites. So it does a call for sites, and then it produces a map that shows every single one of these sites that every single landowner and developer has put forward, no matter how much of a prospect they've got of securing planning permission. And people look at these maps and think they are, every single one of those sites is going to be developed, and panic ensues. It's not the case. It's simply a map showing, well, here's all the land that interested parties have put forward and said, we'd love our land to be allocated in a plan, but it's not saying anything about the prospects of that coming into the plan. So I think that's often where rumours come out. So it's a case of replacing the rumours with fact and letting people know that for here, the process of determining the sites is one that is led by the neighbourhood plan, not something that Waverley is suddenly going to go and do. Sorry, quite a lengthy answer, but I think it's an important question as you raised. Right, there's a lady there and then the gentleman there.
I just want to know, is there a timetable to getting the plan ready? Do we have an end date?
There is no timetable as yet. Again, that will depend on how complex you want to make the plan, how many issues that the community wants to cover. There is no end date, there is no cut-off that if you miss that date, then that's the end of it. It can take as long as you want it to take or need it to take. My observation is it does take longer than people think. As I said, probably a year to prepare the plan. It then starts its statutory processes, 2 rounds of consultation, an independent examination, then a referendum, which a lot of people go, oh my goodness, what? All of that as well, which can take 9 months or so. But that shows you the weight that the plan is afforded at the end. You can't just produce a plan, wave it around and go, this is here we go, it's in place, isn't it great? It has to go through those processes. So realistically, I think we're probably going to look at a period for producing a plan of up to about 2 years. But it's not a case of saying if we miss that, it has to be shelved. Right, so a gentleman here, yes.
How can a neighbourhood plan possibly identify sites for housing until the Waverley Council has actually agreed that those sites are suitable for housing? It's a chicken and egg situation. I mean, there's no sense wasting your time until Waverley Council has said these sites are okay with us.
No, because the neighbourhood plan can determine the suitability. The question was, how can we look at sites until Waverley has determined whether they're suitable? The neighbourhood plan can determine whether they're suitable, and that's something that we can help you with, effectively doing the same job that Waverley would do, looking at the issues of the suitability of the sites, the deliverability of the sites, the sustainability of the sites. So if you've got a site right next to the, close to the centre of a village, there's good pedestrian links, It's got the opportunity. It's not got any really significant landscape impacts. And then you've got another site that's out in the middle of nowhere. You can't get anywhere unless you're in a car. It's going to have major landscape impacts. We're able to look at that and say site A is a quite sustainable site. Site B is demonstrably unsustainable. We can do that ourselves, and it's important to do that in order to present that information to the community, so it is an informed process that the community has in terms of looking at sites. But it's not the case that we have to wait for Waverley's determination on the merits of the sites, because the principles of the way you look at the sustainability of the site actually are largely common sense. Planning is, although it may not seem it a lot of the time, it's actually a lot of common sense.
A lot of council planning decisions.
Planning decisions,
you can be very frustrated by thinking you've done all that work, put a good case together, and it just gets completely scuppered.
That's another matter. That's why you should produce a plan to minimise that prospect. Gentleman there.
A gentleman down there mentioned Witley camps, which was a huge camp which stretched from Milford to Thursday on both sides of the A3 and in between the A3 and the PCNI. Now, would that be considered, it's gone back to the National Trust, would that be considered a reference site?
You can't do it. It's National Trust Fund. You can't do it. It's National Trust Fund.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's whether it's brownfield, it also comes back to the landowner, and one suspects if it's National Trust, it's irrelevant whether it's brownfield, greenfield or bluefield. They're probably not going to want any development on it. But again, it would be... sorry? Right. Yes, right. If there's a legal protection against it, then even more so. So, yeah. Hang on, sorry.
Sorry, I was a related point. You say National Trust is touch, fair enough. What about common land?
Common land is also protected. Common land, well, basically, if you prepare a map of an area and you exclude the areas that you wouldn't develop, common land would come under that, unless there was a compelling reason and you could deal with all the legal issues, but the whole reason it's been protected as common land. So I know there is a lot of common land here. The starting principle would be that is protected from development. Yes, no, sorry, there's a gentleman there.
In the last few years, of the neighbourhood plans that have been published, can you name one that's a best in class or a good one to look at as an example of what constitutes, in your mind, a good plan?
That's a tricky one because they are also different. If you want to look at a Rolls-Royce, all-singing, all-dancing plan, but for a completely different type of place, then one of the very first ones that were produced in Tame in Oxfordshire, South Oxfordshire. But that had an awful lot of money ploughed into it for various reasons, and it's a large market town, so it's a very different area. Was that a copy of it? There you go. There's a copy of it at the back. You can have a look at that. I wouldn't want to say there's one. I would say that one of the things that has been, someone suggested at the last meeting, was that we put a few of these on the Neighbourhood Plan website so people can browse them at their leisure, because they are all of them are different. They're all dealing with different issues and looking at them in a different way. So rather than looking at the plan in its totality, maybe have a look at a few of them to get a flavour, because they've passed, so they're all kind of good in their own way. So what we're going to do is put a few examples of perhaps ones that are more relevant to a community of this size, you know, so it gives you a bit of a feel for things, and then you can have a look. But rather than naming any here, because if I'm being filmed, I'll get shot tomorrow. Someone will ring us up. You didn't name my plan. Then put it back.
Sorry, me again. The majority of people are pretty anti-development in relation to developments that affect them personally. How can you prevent a neighbourhood plan from taking quite a negative stance towards development that may actually improve the area?
Yeah, it's a good question. How can we prevent the sort of no, because it's near me type thing? And indeed, if we're talking about sites, if you just put up a map of sites and say which ones do you like and which ones don't you like, that will simply be a function of where everyone lives. It's human nature. So that's why the process of preparing a plan, we talked about what's the place going to look like in 15 years' time, what do we want it to look like. It's articulating a pretty detailed vision of a place, not a sort of mother and apple pie kind of 3 lines of we want it all to be wonderful and everyone lives in a house that's affordable to them and they jump onto the bus that comes every 5 minutes, all these types of things that aren't going to happen. You know, a reasonable and sensible vision and objectives as to how to deliver that vision. And that is something that should get the input of the community. Because if the community endorses and is involved in and builds and develops that vision, then everything, including the sites and the consideration of those, comes back to that vision. Which of these sites can best help to contribute to deliver the vision? Now, it's still really hard. You cannot prevent someone from coming along and saying, I don't like that site. But if you ask them why, and if they say, well, I don't have a reason other than I live next door to it. Okay, someone lives next door to every single site, so that has to be taken on board. But if as many of the community as possible can help to put together the ultimate vision and objectives, everything comes back to that. So everything comes back to, well, look, this is the vision and objectives that you wanted. This is potentially a site that could help to contribute towards it. But that is one of the biggest challenges of a plan. In an area, it just is. So something we'll have to manage carefully. Right. Last 2 questions. There's one here, and then.
I mean, we've already done a fairly extensive assessment of all these sites. I mean, are you suggesting that Neighbourhood Plan reopen some of those assessments and say, given it red, do you think it could be green, vice versa?
Yes, so the gentleman asked, Waverley has done its own assessment of sites and given them a red, an amber and a green. Can we reopen that? Well, there's several angles to that. Yes, we can look at it, because of course it depends on what the reasons were for giving a site a particular traffic light colour. If red was a fundamental showstopper, it's underwater 10 months of the year or something like that, or it's got a covenant on it that prevents any form of development, and then that's clearly something that we're not going to change. But if there is a reason that potentially there is an issue that could be resolved, then that might change it. Also, often neighbourhood plans do all those sites that they did their red, amber, green assessment on were based on their call for sites. The neighbourhood plan could do its own call for sites, and it's quite surprising how the number of times a neighbourhood plan does a call for land, a call for sites, and it actually brings other sites and opportunities out of the woodwork. So there is another way around it of potentially bringing up other site opportunities that weren't necessarily in that. But that's a good example of the starting context for looking at a site. Waverley have done an assessment, and it will provide a lot of the context, and there will be some sites for which those are just not starters. So I brought you in to take the last question.
Right. Would this neighbourhood planning have an overarching remit to decide where the costing of council spending went, Waverley council spending went, whether more went on highways and less on housing or whatever, if indeed that was a decision that we thought in the community?
Yeah, so the question was, does the neighbourhood plan have the remit to direct what Waverley spends its money on, be it highways or whatever? Directly on a day-to-day basis, no, but what Waverley will be bringing in at some stage in the not too distant future is a new way of collecting contributions from development. So currently there is what's called a Section 106 agreement, which, if you don't know, it's Section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act, and it says that developers make a contribution towards things that will mitigate the impact of its development. So a new housing development brings more people, so there will be contributions towards education and health and all sorts of other things. That is negotiable. So the government has brought in a new system called the Community Infrastructure Levy, CIL, and now, once one of those is in place for Waverley, there will be a fixed charge per square metre of space, non-negotiable, that a developer will make. Now, so a sum of money from every development, without any shadow of doubt, will go to Waverley They can spend that on infrastructure wherever they want. But for you, with a neighbourhood plan, money that's earned within the parish, 25% of that that's earned in the parish will go to the parish council for it to be able to spend on infrastructure. So there will be a direct proportion of money that will go to the parish so it can spend on things that the community wants. But also the neighbourhood plan can identify what your priorities are. Waverley will have this big pot of money to spend. It could spend it anywhere around the borough. It could spend it outside the borough if it wanted to, but I don't think that would be very popular. So it has this pot of money, but it needs to know what to spend it on. So of course, if the neighbourhood plan identifies important infrastructure priorities for the community and articulates that in the plan, then it helps you to get up the list to spend that money on. But it is on new infrastructure. You could spend it on improving the road, patching up the roads and potholes, etc. But it's generally going to be used to spend on new infrastructure. So in a roundabout way, you'll have a lot more influence over what is spent on infrastructure than you do at the moment.
Well, I hope that helped answer as many questions as were posed initially at the beginning of this meeting. Key is we'd like to hear from you as to whether this is a project you want to advance with, and if we are going to advance with it, we hope we get as much participation as possible. But I'd like to thank Chris for his words and his guidance today, and thank you very much.
Chucking deal. Somebody's got to shout for our side, though, haven't they?
Aye, but does every bugger have to shout at our side? Right.
Here we go. On the top,